The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from Ilara's fingers as she scrubbed the flagstones, stole the breath from her lungs in sharp, painful gasps, and stole the memory of warmth from her bones. It was a permanent resident in the great hall of the Skytooth Citadel, a fortress carved into the very peak of the world where winter never truly surrendered. For an Omega like her, the lowest of the low, the cold was more than weather. It was a social status. She was invisible, a ghost in gray rags, head bowed, existing in the peripheral vision of the hulking, fur-clad wolves of the Northern Crest Pack. They strode past, their boots loud and certain on the stones she had just cleaned, their laughter echoing in the high, vaulted ceilings. Their warmth was an insult, a cloud of steam pluming from their mouths that she could see but never feel. Hunger was a dull ache in her belly, a constant companion she had long ago stopped trying to argue with. A plate crashed to the floor nearby. Shards of pottery skittered across her freshly washed section of stone, followed by a smear of greasy stew. Ilara flinched, curling into herself, already bracing for the blow. "Clumsy Omega filth!" snarled a voice. It was Lyra, one of the betas whose favorite pastime was making Ilara's life a fraction more miserable. "Look what you did. You startled me." Ilara didn't look up. Looking up was an invitation for a fist. "I am sorry," she whispered to the floor, her voice thin and brittle as ice. "Sorry won't clean my mess." Lyra's boot nudged a piece of broken ceramic into Ilara's side. It wasn't a hard kick, just a reminder of her place. A piece of meat, slick with gravy, now stained the hem of Ilara's worn tunic. A tremor went through her, a pathetic pang of longing for the discarded morsel. She began to gather the sharp pieces, her raw fingers clumsy. One sliver pierced her thumb. A tiny, perfect bead of red welled up, shockingly bright against her pale skin. She quickly put the thumb in her mouth, the coppery taste a strange and unwelcome richness. Waste not, want not, even her own blood. This was her existence, a cycle of cold, hunger, and quiet endurance. She was born an Omega, a flaw in the pack's genetic tapestry, wolfless and weak. In a society that prized strength above all, she was less than nothing. A burden tolerated out of some ancient, barely remembered law. She finished cleaning the mess, her knees screaming in protest as she rose. She was meant to be invisible, but some days she was a magnet for cruelty. Today was one of those days. The pack was on edge. Whispers slithered through the cold halls like drafts of icy air. Whispers about the king. Alpha King Theron. The Iron King. The Silent Wolf. They said he hadn't been seen in his true wolf form for 5 years. They said his eyes, once the color of molten gold, were now chips of winter ice. His power, the very soul of the pack, was fading. And as his power waned, the ambitions of others grew like mold in the dark. Ilara didn't care about pack politics. It was a storm raging in a sky she wasn't allowed to look at. Her concerns were the floor, the next meager meal, and avoiding the casual cruelty of her betters. As she carried the bucket of filthy water toward the kitchens, a sudden hush fell over the great hall. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but a thick, heavy silence of fear. Every wolf, from the lowest delta to the highest gamma, froze. Their boisterous energy vanished, sucked out of the room. Ilara knew what it meant. She had felt it only a few times in her life, and each time her blood had turned to slush. The king was present. She flattened herself against the stone wall, trying to merge with it, to become just another shadow. She didn't dare look. To meet the Alpha King's eyes was to invite a death sentence, especially for an Omega. His steps were unnervingly quiet for a man his size. The legend said he was a giant, carved from the mountain itself. She heard only the faint whisper of his fur-lined cloak brushing against the stone and the soft, deliberate tread of his boots. He was walking through the center of the hall, and the pack parted before him like the sea before a glacier. Then, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, becoming taut and unbearable. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Please don't see me. Please don't see me." "There was a disturbance?" a voice said. It was not loud, but it filled the entire hall, deep and resonant as the groan of ice breaking on a river. It was a voice that hadn't known warmth in a century. Alara risked a glance from beneath her lashes. He stood not 20 feet away, his back to her. He was addressing Lord Valerius, his chief advisor, a silver-haired wolf whose face was a mask of serene loyalty. "A minor clumsiness, my king," Valerius said, his tone smooth as polished stone. "A servant dropped a plate. It has been handled." The king, Theron, didn't move for a long moment. He was even larger than the stories claimed, a monolith of black fur and hardened leather. His presence was a physical weight, pressing down on the very air. Then he turned. Slowly. Alara's breath caught. Her prayer had failed. His eyes, pale and colorless as a winter sky, swept the room and landed directly on her. It wasn't a glance. It was an impact. She felt it like a physical blow, a jolt that went straight through her thin tunic and into her marrow. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. This was it. For some unknown infraction, for simply existing in his line of sight, she was about to be unmade. But the king's expression wasn't angry. It was nothing. A blank canvas of harsh, handsome features. Yet, his focus was absolute. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the hall, as if the gammas and betas lining the walls were nothing more than tapestries. He took a step toward her. Then another. The pack held its collective breath. Alara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, and their attention was more terrifying than their indifference had ever been. She was no longer invisible. She was a specimen. He stopped directly in front of her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, and still she could only stare at the hard line of his jaw. He smelled of pine and cold stone and something else, something wild and ancient that pricked at her senses. "You," he said. The word was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Inside his mind, for the first time in 5 agonizing years, a low growl echoed. Faint, weak, but there. A beast stirring from a long, cold sleep. He gave no outward sign, but a tremor of shock went through him. His wolf, the fading, silent partner of his soul, had just acknowledged her existence. Alara trembled, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of the bucket. "My king," she stammered, the words barely audible. Lord Valerius stepped forward, a placating smile on his face. "Your Majesty, she is merely an omega. She is of no consequence. Allow me to have her removed." Theron didn't look at his advisor. His gaze remained locked on Alara. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the raw fear in her eyes. But underneath it, he felt something else. A flicker. A resonance his dying wolf was leaning toward like a frozen man leaning toward a distant fire. "No," the king said, his voice quiet but absolute. He lifted a hand and Alara flinched violently, expecting a backhand strike. Instead, his fingers, clad in black leather, brushed a strand of lank hair from her face. The touch was shockingly gentle. It was also cold, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from his very being. The hall erupted in silent, disbelieving shock. The Alpha King did not touch people. Ever. And he certainly did not touch Omegas. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice still low, meant only for her. "Alara, my king." "Ilara." He tasted the name, and the growl in his soul intensified, a thrum of approval. He needed to understand this. This reaction. She was the first thing to stir his wolf in half a decade. She might be his only hope. He dropped his hand and turned to the stunned Hall. This one will be moved to my wing. She will serve me directly. The pronouncement fell into the silence like an executioner's axe. Lord Valerius's placid mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of pure, venomous fury before it was smoothed over again. Lyra and the others who had tormented Ilara looked pale with terror. Ilara simply stared, her mind a complete blank. It didn't make sense. The words were just sounds, disconnected from reality. His wing? Serve him? It was like being told a stone could fly. Come, Theron said, turning his back on her and walking away without a second glance, utterly confident she would follow. And she did. On numb, trembling legs, she left her bucket of dirty water on the floor and followed the Alpha King, the entire pack watching in stunned silence as the Omega Ghost walked into the heart of power. She felt like a lamb being led into a wolf's den. She couldn't decide if she had just been saved or condemned. The King's wing was a world away from the drafty halls and crowded Omega quarters. Here, the stone walls were covered in thick tapestries of ancient battles, carpets of black wolf pelts silenced her footsteps, and fires blazed in every hearth. The air was warm. It was the first thing Ilara noticed. The heat was a shock, a luxury so profound it made her dizzy. She was given new clothes, simple, but made of soft wool that didn't scratch her skin. She was given a small room of her own, with a real bed and a thick fur blanket. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. It was a gilded cage. Her duties were simple and strange. She did not scrub or cook. She was merely present. She sat in a corner of his vast study while he worked at a massive oak desk, poring over maps and reports. She stood by the hearth in his private chambers, feeding the fire while he stared into the flames, lost in thoughts she could not begin to guess. He rarely spoke to her, but he always watched her. She felt his gaze on her constantly, a cool, analytical pressure. He was studying her, and the intensity of his focus made her skin crawl. This was not kindness. It was an experiment. She was a curiosity, a tool he was trying to figure out how to use. The middle build of their relationship was not a slow burn of affection. It was the tense, wary circling of two deeply suspicious creatures. He was the king, desperate to fix the fading power that guaranteed his throne. She was the Omega, desperate to survive her sudden, inexplicable proximity to the most dangerous man in the kingdom. They were genuine adversaries in their goals. One evening, she was replacing the candles in his study. Her hand trembled as she lit a new wick, and a drop of hot wax fell onto the back of her hand. She hissed in pain, dropping the taper. Before she could react, he was there, moving with that unnerving silence. He took her hand in his. His grip was firm but not crushing. His skin, even through his leather gloves, was unnaturally cold. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She tried to pull her hand away, terrified of the contact. "It is nothing, my king." He didn't let go. He turned her hand over, examining the small red mark. "It is not nothing." He looked at her then, his pale eyes seeming to see right through her skull. "Everything that happens to you in this fortress is my concern now." She didn't understand. Was this a threat? A promise? With him, the lines were always blurred. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why me?" He was silent for a long time, his thumb tracing a slow circle on the back of her hand. The cold of his touch was a strange comfort against the sting of the burn. "Because when I am near you," he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a growl, "I am not as silent inside." He was admitting a weakness. A king like Theron did not admit weakness. Ilara's fear was suddenly joined by a new, more dangerous emotion: confusion. He was the predator. She was the prey. but he was looking at her like a dying man looked at his last hope. Their strange, tense cohabitation continued. She learned his habits. He took his tea black and bitter. He never slept for more than a few hours. He carried the cold of the mountain inside him, a deep, internal winter she could feel whenever he was close. One night, a blizzard raged outside, throwing sheets of snow against the thick castle windows. The wind howled like a hungry wolf. Alara was stacking books on a high shelf in the study when the ladder she was on wobbled. She cried out, her arms flailing as she lost her balance. She didn't hit the floor. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, catching her and pulling her flush against a hard chest. It was him. He had moved from his desk across the room in the space of a single heartbeat. She was pressed against him, her cheek against the rough fabric of his tunic. She could feel the solid, unyielding muscle beneath, and for the first time, she felt the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was a lonely, powerful rhythm in the quiet room. He held her for a second longer than was necessary, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "I have you," he murmured. And the words were not a statement of possession, but of reassurance. When he set her back on her feet, the air between them had changed. The space was charged, heavy with unspoken things. The dynamic of captor and captive, of king and servant, was eroding, replaced by something far more complicated. It was in that moment, with the storm screaming outside and the warmth of the fire painting the room in gold, that she saw it. A flicker of something in his icy eyes. Not warmth, not yet. But not the bleak emptiness from before, either. It was a spark, a flicker of life. And she realized her terror was fading. In its place, something else was growing, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Days later, he found her in the small, walled garden on the leeward side of the citadel, the only place where a few hardy winter roses dared to grow. She was tracing the frost on a deep red petal with one finger. He stood beside her, not speaking, just watching the plume of her breath in the frigid air. "They are beautiful," she said quietly, just to break the silence. "To be so fragile, and yet so stubborn." "They are survivors," he corrected softly. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You are a survivor, Alara." It was the first time he had said something personal about her, an observation not related to his own condition. It struck her with the force of a physical blow. He saw her, not as an omega, not as a cure, but as her. The adversarial tension between them was melting, not into simple affection, but into a raw, frightening need. One evening, as he stared into the fire, the lines of exhaustion on his face deeper than she had ever seen them, he spoke without looking at her. "My wolf is fading, Alara," he said, the admission costing him everything. "It has been silent for years. Without it, my claim to the Alpha throne is a lie. The pack feels it. The challengers are circling. Valerius holds them at bay, but his loyalty is tied to my strength. And my strength is failing." She looked at his broad back, at the immense power he projected, and saw for the first time the cracks in the facade. He was just as trapped as she was, but his cage was a kingdom. "But it is not silent," she whispered. "Not always." He finally turned his head, his pale eyes locking onto hers. "No," he said, a world of meaning in that single word. "Not when you are near." This was the turning point. He wasn't her adversary. He was her fellow prisoner. He was drowning, and she was the only one who could feel him thrashing beneath the surface. A week later, he cornered her in the library. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. The air crackled. He had been agitated all day, pacing, his jaw tight. "This is not enough," he growled, the sound raw. "Just being near you. It's like a starving man being given a single crumb. It only makes the hunger worse. My wolf. It wants—" He trailed off, clenching his fists. Alara's heart pounded. She should have been terrified. She was. But she also felt a strange, fierce pull toward him, an instinct to soothe the great wounded beast before her. "What does it want?" she asked, her voice shaking. He looked at her, and the mask of the king was gone. In his eyes was a desperate, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. It was the look of a man who had been utterly alone for centuries. "I cannot simply take what I need from you, Alara," he said, his voice ragged. "It must be given. The bond. It must be accepted." And then, before she could process it, before the world fell apart, he broke his own rules. He broke the rules of his kingdom and 100 generations of alphas. "I am asking you," he said, the words torn from him. "Stay with me, not as a servant, as my equal." And then, quieter, a confession that shattered her world. "I need you." For a king like Theron, those 3 words were more intimate, more binding than any declaration of love. It was a confession of his deepest wound, his most profound failure. He was laying his broken crown at her feet. Unseen in the shadows of a towering bookshelf, Lord Valerius stood, hidden by ancient tapestries. He had been observing them for weeks. He had seen the shift, the growing connection. He had hoped it would be the king's undoing, a dalliance that would prove his weakness. But this was something else. This was the king finding a new source of strength, an omega. The idea was an abomination. Hearing the raw need in his king's voice, Valerius knew he had to act. The slow poison of dissent he had been dripping into the pack's ear was no longer enough. He needed a dagger. He had to sever this connection before it could truly form. He had to destroy the Omega and expose the king as a fool, ruled by a worthless stray. His plan had to accelerate. Now. The summons came 3 days later. A conclave of the crest. All ranking members of the pack were to gather in the Great Hall. The air in the citadel grew thick with anticipation and menace. Alara felt it like a pressure change before a storm. Theron had grown distant again, the Iron King back in place, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Stay in my chambers," he commanded her that morning. "Do not leave." "What is it?" she asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "It is Valerius," Theron said, his voice grim. "He is calling my strength into question. He is demanding a demonstration." "A demonstration?" "A show of dominance, a full shift, something I have not been able to do for 5 years." He looked at her, and for a second the desperate man was back. "He knows I will fail." "Then don't do it," she pleaded. "Refuse." "To refuse is to admit weakness. It is the same as failing." He straightened, the king's mask sliding firmly into place. "I will not hide in my own hall." He left without another word, the sound of his boots echoing with grim finality. Ilara paced the chambers, a prisoner of comfort. The warmth of the fire felt suffocating. She could feel the vibrations of the gathering through the stone floor, the low murmur of 100 powerful wolves assembled below. An hour passed. Then 2. The suspense was a physical agony. Suddenly, her door was thrown open. It wasn't Theron. It was 2 of the king's guard, their faces grim. But they weren't looking at her with the deference they had shown in recent weeks. They were looking at her with cold contempt. "Lord Valerius commands your presence in the Great Hall," one of them growled. "The king told me to stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "Lord Valerius speaks for the pack now," the other guard said, grabbing her arm. His grip was brutal, a reminder of what she was. An Omega. Fear, sharp and sickening, flooded her. They dragged her from the warmth of the king's wing, down the cold stone corridors, back to the world that had always hated her. The great hall was a wall of sound and fury. The pack was on its feet, a sea of snarling, agitated wolves. In the center, on the dais, stood Theron. He looked diminished, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He was surrounded, not by his loyal guard, but by wolves loyal to Valerius, and beside him, looking every bit the concerned, reluctant leader, was Lord Valerius himself. As you can see, Valerius's voice rang out slick with false sorrow. Our king's strength has left him. The great wolf that guarded our pack for centuries is silent. He is empty. Theron's eyes found Alara as the guards shoved her forward into the center of the room. His face was a mask of cold fury, but she saw the flicker of horror in his eyes. This was not his plan. He had been trapped. But what has caused this affliction? Valerius continued, his voice rising. What manner of poison has drained our alpha so? Perhaps it is not a poison, but a witch. He pointed a dramatic finger at Ilara. This Omega. She appeared, and his power waned further. He has hoarded her, kept her close, fallen under her spell. She is no simple Omega. She is an abomination, a creature of unnatural forces. A gasp went through the crowd. Ilara stood frozen, the focus of 1,000 hateful eyes. I have seen it myself, Valerius proclaimed. Objects moving in her presence without being touched, a dark energy that clings to her like a shroud. She has bewitched our king, draining him to feed her own foul magic. He was talking about her power, the small secret flickers she could barely control, a plate that wobbled in the air, a book that slid from a shelf into her hand. She had thought she was going mad, but Valerius had been watching, and he had twisted it into a weapon. This is a lie. Theron's voice boomed, but it lacked its full resonance. It was the roar of a weakened lion. She is under my protection. Your protection? Valerius sneered, his mask of loyalty finally dropping to reveal the naked ambition beneath. You cannot even protect your own power. You are a hollow shell, and you have allowed a witch to fester in the heart of our home. I, Valerius, of the true bloodline, challenge your reign. He drew a long, ceremonial blade from his belt. And I say, we purify this pack. We start by destroying the source of the corruption, seize the witch. The hall exploded into chaos. The pack was splitting right before her eyes. Some wolves surged forward with Valerius's guards, their eyes glowing with fanaticism. Others stood their ground, loyal to Theron, but they were outnumbered and confused. Valerius's guards were on her in a second. She cried out as rough hands seized her, dragging her toward the center dais. She fought, a pathetic, scratching, kicking struggle against hardened warriors. Theron! She screamed, her voice lost in the din. He tried to move toward her, but his own guards, their loyalties now with Valerius, blocked his path. He was a king in a cage of his own men. His face was a terrifying picture of helplessness and rage. They threw her to her knees before Valerius. The cold stone of the dais shocked her skin. Valerius loomed over her, the silver blade gleaming in the torchlight. A pity, he said, his voice a low hiss for her alone. You could have been a useful pet, but you aimed too high. You chose the wrong wolf to enchant. He raised the blade. This was it. The end. A life of cold and hunger. A brief, baffling glimpse of warmth. And now, a cold, sharp death. Her eyes found Theron's across the churning chaos of the hall. She saw his desperation, his agony. He was fighting, roaring, but he was held back. He couldn't save her. In that moment, something inside her broke. Not despair, but rage. A white-hot, silent scream of fury against the injustice of it all. Fury at Valerius. Fury at the pack that had always despised her. Fury that the one person who had finally seen her was being destroyed because of her. She would not die as a witch. She would not die as a victim. The blade began its descent. Time seemed to slow. She saw the polished steel, the hateful glint in Valerius's eyes, the horrified face of her king. And she thought, no. The word was a silent bomb detonating in her soul. It happened in 2 heartbeats. First, from Theron, a sound that no one had heard in 5 years. It was not a human roar of rage. It was a guttural, earth-shaking howl of pure primal wolf, torn from the depths of his being. And with it, something erupted from him. It was not a physical shift. It was bigger. A colossal form of shadow and starlight, a spectral wolf the size of a bear, burst from his chest. It was the ancient spirit of the Alpha, dormant for years, now awakened by the threat to its other half. The spectral wolf paid no heed to the chaos. It ignored Valerius. It ignored Theron's silent, shocked command. With a fluid leap that defied physics, it crossed the 20 feet of the dais and landed directly in front of Alara, planting its massive, translucent paws on the stone between her and the descending blade. It turned its head, its eyes twin novas of burning gold, and unleashed a silent snarl at Valerius that shook the very foundations of the citadel. It had chosen her side. The second heartbeat. As the spectral wolf appeared, the blade in Valerius's hand stopped. It simply stopped, 1 inch from Alara's throat. It hung in the air, vibrating, held by an invisible force. Valerius grunted, trying to force it down, his muscles straining. But the blade would not move. It was held fast. Alara looked up, her eyes wide. Her hands were still bound behind her, but she could feel it. A river of power, hot and fierce, was pouring out of her. The silent, furious no in her soul had become a physical reality. She was holding the blade back with her mind, her survival instinct, her rage, her desperate, burgeoning love for the broken king across the hall. It had all converged into this single, impossible moment. Her power, hidden and feared her whole life, had finally erupted to save her. The great hall fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Every wolf, rebel, and loyalist alike stared at the impossible scene. The legendary spirit wolf of the Alpha, shielding a lowly Omega, a witch's blade frozen in midair by an unseen power. The pack split. It was not a debate. It was an instinctual seismic shift. Half the wolves in the hall, the older ones, the ones who remembered the legends, saw the sign. The spirit of the pack had made its choice. It had not chosen the challenger with his blade and his lies. It had chosen the Omega Girl defended by a power they had never seen. Their loyalty, wavering for so long, snapped back into place with the force of a tectonic plate. They turned, as one, on Valerius's faction, their growls rising to a crescendo. The other half, the younger, more ambitious wolves loyal to Valerius, saw only abomination. A failed king and his witch consort. Their fear and hatred solidified into resolve. In that moment, with his wolf standing guard over the woman he now knew was his mate, the final piece of Theron's power clicked into place. The bond, forced by circumstance, tested by adversity, and now sealed in a moment of mutual desperation, flared to life. The cold that had lived in his bones for a century vanished, replaced by a roaring furnace of power. His eyes, for so long the color of ice, blazed into molten gold. With a roar that was fully his own, he shattered the grip of the guards, holding him as if they were children. The battle was not a battle. It was a culling. Theron, filled with a power he hadn't felt since his youth, moved through the rebels like a storm. His newly awakened loyalists, their faith restored by the sign from the spirit wolf, fell upon their treacherous packmates with righteous fury. Alara remained kneeling, the blade still hovering before her, the spectral wolf a silent, shimmering guardian. She watched as Theron, her broken, silent king, reclaimed his throne not with words, but with tooth and claw. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. He was hers. Valerius, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, finally broke. He dropped the uselessly frozen blade and tried to flee, but he was cut off. Theron cornered him against the throne itself. "You were my brother," Theron growled, his voice vibrating with 1,000 years of alpha lineage. "You were weak," Valerius spat, blood trickling from his lip. "You let this pack wither while you nursed your own decay. I would have made it strong again." "You would have made it a tyranny built on lies," Theron countered. "You mistook silence for weakness. My wolf was not dying, Valerius." He glanced back at Alara, his golden eyes softening for a fraction of a second. It was waiting, waiting for its queen. He did not kill his former advisor. That was too quick. He disabled him with a precise, crippling blow and had him dragged to the deepest, coldest dungeon in the citadel. The fighting stopped. The hall was a wreck of overturned tables and wounded wolves, but the rebellion was crushed. The split was over before it had truly begun. Slowly, Theron walked back to the dais. The loyal half of his pack watched him, their eyes full of a new, profound awe. He stopped before Ilara. The great spectral wolf looked at him, gave a silent nod of approval, and then dissolved back into his chest, leaving a warmth that spread through his entire body. The blade, released from her control, clattered to the stone floor. The guards who had held her were now kneeling, their heads bowed to the ground in terror and supplication. Theron knelt before her, the king, before the Omega. He reached out and, with a gentleness that made her heart ache, he untied the ropes binding her wrists. She looked at her hands, then at him. He was no longer the cold, analytical king. He was no longer the desperate, broken man. He was whole. He was magnificent. And he was looking at her as if she were the sunrise. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He cupped her face in his hands, his skin no longer cold, but radiating a fierce, living warmth. "You saved me." Tears she didn't know she had been holding back began to stream down her face. "You saved me," she whispered back. "We saved each other." He smiled, a true, breathtaking smile that transformed his harsh features. It was the first time she had ever seen it. "The bond is complete. Can you feel it?" She could. It was a golden thread humming between them, a current of strength, warmth, and an overwhelming sense of belonging. The hole in her soul that had been carved out by a lifetime of being an Omega was gone. In its place was him. "I love you," he said, the words simple, direct, and more powerful than any roar. "I think I have from the moment I first saw you, and I was just too frozen to know it." "I love you," she replied, the words feeling like the most natural truth she had ever spoken. She, the Omega Ghost, loved the Alpha King, and he loved her back. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of possession or of gratitude. It was a kiss of equals, a king and his queen, a wolf and his mate, a survivor and a survivor. In front of the wreckage of their broken pack, under the watchful eyes of their new world, they sealed their future. It was a promise made in fire and blood and magic, and it was unbreakable. Months passed. Winter's grip on the mountain fortress loosened, giving way to a fierce, vibrant spring. The snows melted, and for the first time in memory, tiny purple flowers bloomed in the cracks of the citadel's stone. The pack said it was the Luna's magic. Alara was no longer a ghost. She was Luna Alara, queen of the northern crest, and she walked beside her king not as a servant, but as his partner. The remaining wolves, their loyalty absolute, looked at her with a reverence that still sometimes startled her. They saw the woman whose power had held a blade at bay. They saw the woman the pack's own spirit had chosen to defend. They saw their queen. She was learning to control her gift. Theron helped her. They would spend hours in the quiet garden, where she would practice lifting fallen leaves from the ground, making them dance in the air in swirling patterns. Her power was not dark or foul, as Valerius had claimed. It was a part of her, as natural as breathing. It was the physical manifestation of a will that had refused to break. Theron was transformed. The vitality of the completed mate bond had not just restored his wolf, it had amplified it. He was stronger, more decisive, and more vital than ever. But the coldness was gone, replaced by a warmth that he reserved only for her. The pack saw a powerful, revitalized king. Ilara saw the man who brought her a cup of tea in the morning, the man whose hand always found hers when they walked the battlements, the man who would watch her with a look of quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. One morning she woke to find him watching her, his golden eyes soft in the dawn light. "What is it?" she murmured, tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm remembering the silence," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I'm thanking the gods for the day you were dragged before my throne." "I thought you were going to kill me," she confessed. "My wolf knew better," he said, kissing her brow. It knew it was looking at its own heart. They ruled together. His strength and her resilience. His power and her compassion. They healed the wounds of the pack split, exiling those whose treachery ran too deep, and showing mercy to those who had been led astray by fear. The Northern Crest Pack, once teetering on the edge of collapse, became stronger and more united than it had been in a century. That afternoon, they stood on the highest balcony of the citadel, looking out over the vast expanse of their domain. The mountain peaks stabbed a sky of brilliant blue, and the wind that whipped around them was no longer a thief, but a clean, wild song of freedom. Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped a strong arm around her. She was no longer cold. She thought she might never be cold again. She had a home. She had a family. She had a place. She, the Omega who was worth nothing, had become the linchpin that had saved them all. "Are you happy, Ilara?" Theron asked quietly, his lips against her hair. She looked up at him, at her king, her mate, her friend. She smiled, a real radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I am." And in the heart of the mountain, a new chapter began, built not on old laws of blood and strength, but on the unshakable foundation of a love that had been forged in the crucible of a pack divided, and a wolf that had known its queen at first sight. The world had tried to break them both, but together they were whole.